8 million horses died in World War I. But the ones that survived did something that no human soldier could do, and the generals knew it. Animals weren't just present during World War I, they were essential. Horses carried supplies through mud that would swallow trucks. Dogs found wounded soldiers in the dark when human medics couldn't. Pigeons flew through artillery fire carrying messages that saved entire battalions. These animals did jobs that humans couldn't do and technology couldn't replace, and millions of them died doing it. This is the story of the animals that fought in World War I. The horses that charged into machine gun fire, the dogs that crawled through no man's land, the pigeons that flew through poison gas. Because understanding their role shows you a side of the war that's rarely told, where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to a horse that wouldn't quit or a pigeon that made it home. When World War I started in 1914, armies still relied heavily on horses. This seems strange now when we think of World War I as a modern, mechanized war with tanks and airplanes. But the reality is that horses were everywhere. Millions of them. They pulled artillery, carried supplies, transported troops, carried cavalry charges. Without horses, armies couldn't function. The numbers are staggering. Britain alone used over 1 million horses during the war. Germany used around 1.4 million. France used similar numbers. Russia used millions more. America, entering late, still used hundreds of thousands. All told, somewhere between 8 and 10 million horses served in World War I. To put this in perspective, more horses died in World War I than American soldiers in all of America's wars combined. The scale of animal casualties was enormous, often overlooked in histories that focus on human suffering. But to the soldiers who worked with these animals, their deaths were deeply felt and often mourned as much as human casualties. These weren't wild horses or random animals. They were carefully selected, purchased from farms and breeders across Europe and America. When Britain declared war, the army began requisitioning horses from civilians. Officers would show up at farms with authority to take horses for military service. Farmers would be compensated, but the horses were gone, needed for the war effort. The requisitioning was traumatic for farming families. A good horse was valuable, essential for farming, often treated almost like a family member. Children who'd grown up with these horses would watch them being taken away, knowing they'd probably never see them again. The horses were given to the army and shipped to war, and most of them never came back. There are stories of children crying as their horses were led away, of farmers trying to hide their best horses, of families losing their primary means of working their land. In rural communities, a horse wasn't just a horse animal. It was a work partner, a source of income, sometimes the difference between a family making it through the year or not. Taking horses for the war effort created real hardship. In America, the British and French bought horses by the thousands before America entered the war. Horse dealers would buy horses from farms and ranches, then sell them to Allied purchasing agents. Prices were good, so many farmers sold willingly. But this meant America was supplying horses for the war, even before American soldiers went to fight. American horses were particularly prized. They were often larger and stronger than European horses, bred for the heavy work of American farming. Western horses were valued for their endurance. Draft horses from the Midwest were valued for their strength. These horses were purchased by the tens of thousands, loaded onto ships, and sent across the Atlantic. The ocean voyage itself was traumatic for horses. They'd be loaded into the holds of ships, confined in stalls, unable to move much for weeks at a time. Many horses died during a transport from injury, illness, or simply from the stress of the voyage. Those that survived arrived in Europe already weakened, then were immediately sent to war. The conditions for horses at war were terrible. They lived in the same mud as the soldiers, often without proper shelter. They were worked constantly, pulling heavy loads through difficult terrain. They were underfed because getting enough food to the front lines was difficult. And they were killed in huge numbers by artillery, machine guns, poison gas, and disease. Horses pulling artillery were particularly vulnerable. Artillery pieces were heavy, requiring teams of horses to move them. These horse teams would be exposed during moves, making them targets for enemy fire. A single artillery shell could kill an entire team. Machine gun fire would cut down horses and riders alike. The casualty rate among artillery horses was horrific. A typical field. Artillery piece required 6 to 8 horses to pull it. Heavy guns required even more, sometimes 12 or more horses. These teams had to move the guns into position, often under fire, then move them again when positions changed. The horses were exposed, large targets that enemy gunners aimed for because destroying artillery horses meant the guns couldn't be moved. Artillery horses wore special harnesses designed for the heavy work. The lead horses, called wheelers, did the heaviest pulling and had to be the strongest. The horses in front, called leaders, had to be smart and responsive because they guided the team. A good artillery horse team worked together like a machine, but they could be destroyed in seconds by enemy fire. The mud of the Western Front was especially hard on horses. The churned-up ground turned to mud by rain, and artillery would swallow horses. They'd sink into the mud and couldn't get out. Soldiers would try to save them, digging around them, pulling with ropes. But often, the horse would be stuck too deep, exhausted, and would have to be shot rather than left to die slowly in the mud. There are accounts of horses screaming in pain and fear, stuck in mud, being shelled by artillery. Soldiers who survived the war often said that the sounds of wounded and dying horses haunted them as much as the sounds of wounded men. The horses couldn't understand what was happening to them, couldn't comprehend the war, and their suffering was seen as particularly tragic. The mud was thick, deep, and everywhere. Shell craters would fill with water and mud. Roads would disappear into soupy messes. Horses would step into what looked like solid ground and sink up to their bellies or deeper. The panic in the horses' eyes, the desperate struggling, the eventual exhaustion and acceptance, soldiers found these things harder to watch than human suffering. Some soldiers would stay with a stuck horse for hours trying to save it, even under fire. They'd dig, pull, encourage the horse to keep trying. Sometimes they'd succeed and get the horse free. More often, they'd have to give up and shoot the horse to end its suffering. These were hard decisions that affected the soldiers deeply. Cavalry charges, which had been the glory of warfare for centuries, proved to be suicidal against modern weapons. Machine guns and artillery could kill cavalry units before they got close to enemy lines. Yet cavalry was still used, partly because generals were slow to adapt, and partly because cavalry was still useful for reconnaissance and pursuit in areas where the front was more mobile. The charge of the British cavalry at High Wood during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 showed the futility of cavalry against modern defenses. The cavalry charged German positions across open ground. Machine guns and artillery opened fire. Horses and men were cut down in minutes. It was a massacre, achieving nothing except proving that cavalry charges were obsolete. The cavalrymen knew the charge was likely to fail. They'd seen what machine guns did to infantry. They knew horses were even bigger targets. But orders were orders. They formed up, drew their swords or lances, and charged. The horses ran bravely toward the German lines, and most of them died before getting close. The few who made it through accomplished nothing because there were too few to be effective. But horses remained essential for logistics. Trucks and trains could move supplies part of the way, but the last miles to the front lines often had to be covered by horse-drawn wagons. The roads were too damaged, too muddy, too rough for trucks. Horses could go where vehicles couldn't, which made them irreplaceable despite the casualties. Supply columns of horse-drawn wagons stretched for miles behind the front lines. These wagons carried ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, everything an army needed. Horses pulling these wagons worked constantly, often at night to avoid observation by enemy artillery. They were essential to keeping armies functioning. The supply runs were dangerous. Enemy artillery would target supply columns, knowing that destroying supplies hurt the enemy's ability to fight. The horses pulling wagons through shelling had no protection, no way to hide. They just pulled their loads, obeying their drivers, dying when shells landed near them. New horses would be brought up and the supply runs would continue. Horses also served in cavalry units that were used for reconnaissance and raiding. On the Eastern Front and in the Middle East, where the fighting was more mobile than on the Western Front, cavalry remained important throughout the war. In the vast spaces of Russia or the deserts of Arabia, cavalry could cover ground that infantry couldn't. The charge of the Australian light horse at Beersheba in October 1917 is one of the last successful cavalry charges in history. Australian cavalry charged across 4 miles of open ground toward Turkish positions. They took the town and secured water supplies for the British Army. It worked partly because the Turks weren't expecting such a charge and didn't have the concentrated firepower to stop it. The Beersheba charge was desperate. The British Army needed the water wells in the town or they'd have to retreat. The Australians decided to charge directly, using speed and surprise. They galloped across the open desert toward Turkish trenches. The Turks fired at them but couldn't stop the momentum. The cavalry jumped the trenches, fought hand-to-hand in the streets, and captured the town. It was a rare cavalry success in a war where such charges usually failed. Horses also suffered from poison gas. When gas attacks occurred, horses would breathe in the gas and suffer terrible deaths. Gas masks were eventually developed for horses, which looked absurd but were necessary. The masks were difficult to fit properly and difficult to. Horses often resisted wearing them, but they saved lives when they were used correctly. A horse in a gas mask was a strange sight, something from a nightmare. The masks covered the horse's nose and muzzle, with big glass eyepieces. Horses didn't understand why these contraptions were being put on them and would often panic, but trained horses would tolerate the masks, understanding that their handlers were trying to help them. The gas masks for horses were large, awkward affairs that covered most of the horse's head. They had filters and valves similar to human gas masks, but scaled up. Getting a panicked horse to wear a gas mask during a gas attack was difficult and sometimes impossible. Horses would shake their heads, trying to get the masks off, which could break the seal and let gas in. Dogs served in World War I in roles that were sometimes even more dangerous than what horses did. Dogs were used as messengers, carrying messages between units when telephone lines were cut or radio communication was impossible. They were used to find wounded soldiers in no man's land. They were used to lay communication wire. They were used to pull small carts with supplies or wounded soldiers. Messenger dogs were trained to run between two handlers, carrying messages in tubes attached to their collars. When telephone lines were cut by artillery, which happened constantly, dogs could carry messages where humans couldn't go safely. A dog was a smaller target than a human, faster, and could navigate through shell craters and barbed wire more easily. These dogs would run across no man's land, through artillery fire, past machine gun positions, to deliver their messages. Many were killed, but many succeeded where human messengers would have died. A trained messenger dog could cover ground between trenches in minutes, while a human runner might take much longer and had a much lower chance of making it. The training for messenger dogs was intensive and started young. Puppies would be trained to run between two handlers, rewarded when they reached the right person. As they grew, the distance would increase and distractions would be added. Eventually, they'd be trained to run through simulated battlefield conditions, with loud noises and obstacles. The best messenger dogs were fast, smart, and fearless. One famous messenger dog was Rags, a terrier adopted by the American Army. Rags carried messages during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, including one crucial message that saved his unit from friendly fire. He was wounded by gas and shrapnel but survived and became a decorated war dog. After the war, he lived to old age in America, celebrated as a hero. Rags was found in Paris by an American soldier and adopted as a mascot, but Rags proved to be more than a mascot. The dog learned to carry messages, to warn of incoming artillery by cocking his head at the sound of shells, to comfort wounded soldiers. Rags was with his unit through major battles, was wounded multiple times, and earned the devotion of the soldiers who served with him. Another remarkable dog was Stubby, who became the most decorated war dog of World War I. Stubby was a stray adopted by American soldiers. He served in 17 battles, could warn of gas attacks before humans could smell the gas, found wounded soldiers, and once caught a German spy by the seat of his pants, literally. Stubby became a celebrity after the war, met presidents, and had an obituary in major newspapers when he died. Stubby's story seems almost too good to be true, but is well documented. The dog became the mascot of the 102nd Infantry Regiment. He learned to salute by raising his paw when soldiers saluted. He could hear incoming shells before humans and would warn soldiers to take cover. His keen nose could detect gas before humans could, giving crucial early warning. The story of Stubby catching a German spy is particularly remarkable. According to accounts, a German soldier in an American uniform was mapping Allied positions. Stubby confronted the man, who tried to be friendly, but Stubby sensed something was wrong and bit the man on the leg, holding on and barking until American soldiers came and captured the spy. Whether the story is entirely accurate is debated, but it was widely reported and believed at the time. Casualty dogs, also called mercy dogs or Red Cross dogs, were trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. They'd be sent out after battles to search no man's land for wounded men. The dogs wore packs with medical supplies. If a dog found a wounded soldier who could help himself, the soldier would take supplies from the pack. If the soldier was too badly wounded, the dog would return to handlers who'd send out medics. These dogs saved countless lives by finding soldiers who would have died if left undiscovered. A dog's sense of smell could find wounded soldiers in the dark or in difficult terrain where visual searching was impossible. The dogs could distinguish between living wounded soldiers and corpses, saving time and ensuring medics were sent to those who could still be saved. The casualty dogs worked mostly at night, searching the area between trenches where soldiers lay wounded. This was incredibly dangerous. The area was exposed to enemy fire, covered with barbed wire and shell craters and filled with hazards. The dogs would navigate this terrain, searching by scent for wounded soldiers, working quietly to avoid drawing fire. The training for these dogs was intensive. They had to learn to ignore the noise of battle, to not be scared by explosions and gunfire. They had to learn to navigate trenches and barbed wire. They had to learn to discriminate between friendly and enemy soldiers. though this was less of a concern than finding wounded men of any nationality. German casualty dogs were trained to bring back identification tags from dead soldiers, helping to identify casualties. French and British dogs would stay with wounded soldiers who couldn't move, providing comfort until help arrived. Some wounded soldiers reported that having a dog lie beside them in no man's land, providing warmth and company, gave them the will to hold on until medics could reach them. Dogs were also used to pull machine guns and small carts. In areas where horses were too large or too valuable to risk, dogs could pull loads through trenches or across difficult ground. This was hard work, and many dogs were injured or killed doing it, but it moved equipment that needed to be moved. The Belgian army used dogs extensively to pull machine guns. The dogs would be harnessed in pairs or small teams to carts carrying machine guns and ammunition. This gave Belgian troops mobility that was difficult to achieve otherwise. The dogs became symbols of Belgian resistance and were celebrated in propaganda. Photos of Belgian dogs pulling machine guns were widely circulated as propaganda. The images showed small dogs working hard to support the war effort, which appealed to public emotion and helped generate support for Belgium. The dogs were portrayed as brave and loyal, doing their part for their country. This propaganda was effective, but also led to more dogs being used in dangerous roles. Pigeons might seem like unlikely war heroes, but they were crucial for communication. Radio technology was primitive and unreliable. Telephone wires were constantly cut by artillery. In this environment, pigeons provided the most reliable way to send messages from the front lines back to headquarters. Pigeons have a homing instinct. If you take a pigeon away from its home and release it, it will fly back. This ability was used for military communication. Pigeons would be kept at headquarters, then taken to frontline units. When a message needed to be sent, it would be written on thin paper, put in a small tube, attached to the pigeon's leg, and the pigeon would be released. It would fly back to headquarters, delivering the message. The system was remarkably effective. Pigeons could fly 50 miles or more in less than an hour. They could navigate in conditions that would ground aircraft. They could fly through artillery fire, gas, rain, and arrive with their messages. The success rate was over 90%, which was better than any other communication method available. Pigeons navigate using multiple methods. They use the sun and magnetic fields for direction. They recognize landmarks. They possibly use sound and smell. Scientists still don't fully understand how pigeons navigate so accurately, but the military used this ability without needing to understand it completely. The important thing was that it worked. The British alone used about 250,000 pigeons during the war. The French and Germans used similar numbers. Specialized pigeon services were established, with soldiers trained in pigeon care and message handling. Pigeons were valuable, carefully bred, and well cared for despite the conditions. Pigeon lofts were set up behind the lines, where pigeons were kept and bred. The lofts were well maintained, with the pigeons fed regularly and protected from predators and weather. Soldiers assigned to pigeon service took their job seriously, understanding that these birds might be the only way to get critical messages through when other communications failed. One of the most famous pigeons was Cher Ami, who served with the American Army. In October 1918, the Lost Battalion was cut off behind German lines, surrounded, running out of ammunition and food. Worse, they were being hit by friendly artillery because American forces didn't know where they were. The battalion commander sent pigeons with messages to stop the artillery. The first pigeons were shot down. Cher Ami was the last chance. The Lost Battalion situation was desperate. The unit was trapped in a ravine, surrounded by Germans. They were taking casualties from German machine guns and snipers. Then American artillery started shelling the area, not knowing American troops were there. The shelling killed and wounded more men. The battalion commander, Major Charles Whittlesey, was frantically trying to get messages out to stop the friendly fire. Cher Ami was released with a desperate message giving the battalion's location and begging the artillery to stop firing. German soldiers saw the pigeon and shot at it. Cher Ami was hit, losing an eye and a leg, with a bullet through the chest. But the pigeon kept flying. It made it back to headquarters, 25 miles away, in less than half an hour. The message was received, the artillery stopped, and about 200 American soldiers were saved. The message attached to Cher Ami's leg read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." This simple message, delivered by a wounded pigeon, saved lives and became one of the most famous moments in pigeon military service. Cher Ami survived, was treated by army medics who even carved a small wooden leg for the pigeon, and became famous. The pigeon was awarded the Croix de Guerre by France and became a symbol of bravery and determination. When Cherami died in 1919, the body was preserved and is now in the Smithsonian Museum. After the war, Cherami's body was mounted and put on display. The wooden leg is visible, as are the injuries from the battle. The pigeon became a symbol of determination and the unexpected heroes of war. Schoolchildren would visit the museum to see Cher Ami, learning about bravery and sacrifice from the story of a small bird that refused to quit. Another heroic pigeon was G.I. Joe, who saved the lives of British soldiers in 1943 during World War II, but the tradition of using pigeons in combat started in World War I. The pigeons proved so effective in World War I that they continued to be used through World War II and even into the Korean War, though by then radio technology had mostly replaced them. Pigeons flew through conditions that seem impossible. They flew through artillery barrages, through poison gas, through storms. Many were killed by enemy fire, by hawks trained to intercept them, or by the harsh conditions. But enough made it through that the system worked, and thousands of messages were successfully delivered. The sight of a pigeon flying through an artillery barrage was remarkable. Shells would explode around them, shrapnel flying in all directions. The pigeons would fly through the smoke and debris, sometimes hit by shrapnel or concussion, but they'd keep flying. Their determination to return home drove them through conditions that would make most creatures give up. The Germans trained hawks to hunt Allied pigeons. They'd release hawks when pigeons were spotted, hoping to intercept messages. This worked sometimes, but the sheer number of pigeons meant that many messages still got through. It became an aerial war of pigeons versus hawks, with military consequences depending on the outcome. The hawks were trained by falconers who'd worked with birds of prey before the war. They'd train hawks to hunt pigeons specifically, rewarding them for catching pigeons and bringing them down. Some hawks became quite effective at this, catching multiple pigeons, but pigeons are fast and maneuverable, and many escaped even when hawks pursued them. Other animals served in smaller numbers but still made contributions. Mules were used extensively, especially in mountain terrain where even horses struggled. Mules are more sure-footed than horses and can carry heavy loads over rough ground. They were essential in places like the Italian Alps, where much of the fighting involved moving supplies up and down mountains. The fighting in the Italian Alps was particularly challenging. Supplies had to be carried up steep mountain paths, often in snow and ice. Mules could navigate. These paths where vehicles couldn't go. They carried ammunition, food, weapons, everything needed by troops fighting at high altitudes. The mules worked in dangerous conditions, on narrow paths where a misstep meant a fatal fall. Canaries and mice were used to detect poison gas. They're more sensitive to gas than humans, so they'd show symptoms before people were affected. Miners had used canaries for this purpose for years, and the practice was adapted for war. A canary in distress meant gas was present and masks needed to be put on immediately. Soldiers would carry caged canaries into tunnels or trenches where gas might accumulate. If the canary showed signs of distress, became drowsy, or died, it meant gas was present and men needed to put on masks or evacuate. This early warning system saved lives, though it cost the lives of many small birds who couldn't understand they were serving as warnings. Cats were kept by soldiers to control rats and mice, which were everywhere in the trenches, feeding on food and corpses. The cats also provided companionship and a connection to normal life. Soldiers would adopt cats, keep them as mascots, care for them despite the difficult conditions. These cats lived in the trenches alongside the men. The rats in the trenches were huge, bold, and everywhere. They'd eat food supplies, gnaw on equipment, crawl over sleeping soldiers. The rats fed on corpses in no man's land, growing large and losing their fear of humans. Cats helped control the rat population and were valued for this practical reason as well as for the companionship they provided. Even larger animals were used in some places. Elephants were used by German circuses to haul equipment before being requisitioned for the war effort. Camels were used extensively in the Middle East campaigns. Donkeys were used for transport in rough terrain. Essentially, any animal that could be useful was pressed into service. The use of elephants in the war, since in a high effort, was limited, but did happen. In Germany, where labor shortages were severe, circus elephants were used to plow fields and haul heavy equipment. The sight of elephants doing farm work or industrial work was strange and became part of the surreal landscape of total war, where everything, even circus animals, was mobilized. The treatment of animals during the war was a mix of necessity, affection, and callousness. Many soldiers loved the animals they worked with, treated them well, shared their rations even when food was scarce. Horses would be groomed and cared for by their handlers who knew the horse's survival was linked to their own. Dogs and pigeons were often seen as comrades and friends. The bonds between soldiers and animals were real and deep. A soldier assigned to work with a horse would spend every day with that animal, caring for it, working with it, depending on it. They'd learn the horse's personality, its quirks, its strengths and weaknesses. When the horse was killed, the grief was genuine. Many soldiers wrote about their horses in letters home, mourning them as they would mourn human friends, but the conditions of war made it impossible to care for animals properly. Veterinary care was limited, food was often insufficient, shelter was inadequate, and when military necessity demanded it, animals were worked until they dropped or were sent into situations where their death was almost certain. The needs of the war overrode concerns about animal welfare. There are accounts of soldiers weeping over dead horses, of men risking their lives to save wounded animals, of last bits of food being shared with dogs. But there are also accounts of horses being worked to death, of wounded animals being shot and left because there was no time to bury them, of callousness born from the brutality of the war. The contradiction was painful for many soldiers. They loved their horses and dogs, wanted to care for them properly, but the demands of war made that impossible. They'd have to watch horses work themselves to death pulling guns through mud. They'd have to shoot wounded horses that could have been saved if resources had been available. This caused moral injury that some soldiers carried for the rest of their lives. Veterinary services did exist. The British Army Veterinary Corps treated hundreds of thousands of horses during the war. They set up field hospitals for horses, performed surgeries, treated diseases. About 2 million horses passed through British veterinary hospitals during the war, and many were saved and returned to service. This was partly humane concern and partly practical, because replacing horses was expensive and difficult. The veterinary hospitals were remarkable operations. They had stalls for hundreds of horses, operating theaters, farriers to shoe horses, and trained veterinarians. The hospitals would receive wounded and sick horses, triage them, treat those who could be saved, and humanely destroy those who couldn't. It was medicine practiced under difficult conditions, often close to the front lines. The veterinarians faced challenges that human doctors didn't. A wounded horse is large, strong, and can be dangerous if it panics. Treating a horse under battlefield conditions with limited equipment and supplies required skill and bravery. Veterinarians worked close to the front lines, often under fire, to save animals that the army needed. Surgeries on horses had to be done quickly and efficiently. Unlike human patients, horses couldn't be kept immobilized for long recovery periods. A horse that couldn't walk or work had to be destroyed because the army couldn't support non-working animals. This meant veterinarians had to achieve results quickly or make the hard decision to euthanize. But many animals couldn't be saved. Horses with broken legs were usually shot because there was no way to treat them and keep them with the army. Horses too sick or injured to work were often killed rather than left to suffer or become burdens. The calculus was brutal but necessary in the context of war. The decision to destroy a horse was never easy. Handlers would often beg veterinarians to try to save a horse, even when the prognosis was hopeless. The veterinarians had to balance humane concerns with military necessity. A horse in pain, with no hope of recovery, had to be destroyed, even if its handler was begging for its life. These were heartbreaking decisions made daily. At the end of the war, what happened to the surviving animals was often tragic. Many horses were sold to French and Belgian farmers rather than being shipped back to Britain. The cost of transporting millions of horses back to their home countries was considered too high, so horses that had served faithfully were sold, often ending up in slaughterhouses or worked until they died. This fate for war horses was controversial. People in Britain were outraged when they learned that horses that had served the nation were being sold for meat rather than being brought home and cared for. There was public outcry, but economic realities meant that most horses stayed in Europe, sold off cheaply after the war. The outcry led to some changes. Some horses were brought back, particularly officers' horses and horses that had become famous. Organizations formed to try to save war horses and find them good homes, but the numbers were too large and the resources too limited. Most war horses ended their service in Europe, far from the farms and homes where they'd been born. Some horses did make it home. Officers' horses, particularly valuable horses, animals that had become famous, these sometimes were brought back. They'd be retired to farms, live out their lives in peace. But they were the tiny minority. Most war horses ended their lives in Europe, far from home, after years of service. The horses that did return were often damaged by their service. They bore scars from wounds. They were weakened by years of hard work and inadequate food. Many were psychologically damaged, made nervous and difficult by the trauma of war. Even in retirement, they carried the marks of what they'd been through. Dogs generally had better fates. Many were adopted by soldiers who'd worked with them. Dogs are smaller and easier to transport than horses, so bringing them home was more feasible. Many war dogs lived out their lives with the families of the soldiers they'd served with, treated as heroes and beloved pets. Some war dogs became famous and lived comfortable lives after the war. Stubby lived in luxury, was a celebrity, attended events. But many war dogs suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD. They'd be nervous around loud noises, aggressive toward strangers, difficult to handle. The war had changed them, just as it had changed human veterans. Pigeons that survived were also sometimes brought home, added to breeding stocks, or given to breeders. Some of the most successful war pigeons became valuable for breeding, their offspring carrying the genetics that had made them successful. In this way, the war pigeon's legacy continued in their descendants. Pigeon racing became more popular after the war, partly because of the fame war pigeons had achieved. People wanted to own descendants of famous war pigeons. Breeding programs focused on the traits that made good military pigeons: speed, stamina, homing ability, determination. The genetic legacy of war pigeons influenced pigeon breeding for generations. The legacy of animals in World War I is complicated. Their service was essential. Without horses, armies couldn't have functioned. Without dogs and pigeons, communication and rescue operations would have failed. These animals did jobs that technology of the time couldn't replace. They saved human lives, carried crucial messages, moved essential supplies. The military recognized this dependence, even if it didn't always translate into good treatment. Reports and after-action assessments regularly noted the crucial role of animals. Commanders understood that their operations depended on horses, that critical messages got through because of pigeons, that wounded soldiers were saved because of dogs. The animals were essential to military success, but millions of animals died, often in terrible ways. They were forced into a war they couldn't understand, subjected to conditions that were cruel, and killed in numbers that are hard to comprehend. 8 to 10 million horses dead is a staggering number. Dogs, pigeons, mules, all died in large numbers. They had no choice in being there, no understanding of why they were suffering. The question of whether it was right to use animals this way is complicated. From a practical standpoint, there was no choice. The technology to replace horses didn't exist. Trucks were too unreliable, couldn't handle the terrain, radio was too primitive to replace pigeons. Other methods for finding wounded soldiers weren't as effective as dogs. The animals were needed, and without them, even more humans would have died. Armies tried to develop alternatives. Trucks were improved and used increasingly as the war progressed. Radio technology advanced, but none of these technologies were reliable enough to fully replace animals during World War I. Even by 1918, horses were still essential for moving artillery and supplies in the final offensives that won the war. But from an ethical standpoint, forcing animals into war raises questions that don't have easy answers. Animals can't consent. They can't understand what's happening to them or why. Their suffering was involuntary and, from their perspective, meaningless. The fact that their service was necessary doesn't make their suffering less real or less troubling. Modern military ethics considers the treatment of animals. Rules about animal welfare exist even in combat. The lessons learned from World War I and later conflicts have led to better treatment of military animals. But the fundamental ethical question remains: is it right to use animals in war, even when their service saves human lives? The memorials to war animals are scattered across Europe and other places where fighting occurred. The Animals in War Memorial in London honors the animals that served in British forces. It has inscriptions reading, "They had no choice," and acknowledges the millions of animals that suffered and died. Similar memorials exist in other countries, recognizing the debt owed to animals. The London Memorial features sculptures of horses, dogs, and mules walking through a gap in a wall. On one side of the wall are sculptures of a horse and a dog, representing the animals still serving. The inscriptions are simple but powerful. This monument is dedicated to all the animals that served and died alongside British and Allied forces, in wars and campaigns throughout time, and they had no choice. These memorials are important because they acknowledge a truth that was often overlooked. The focus on human casualties and human heroism sometimes obscured the reality that millions of other creatures suffered and died in the war. The animals deserve to be remembered, their service acknowledged, their suffering recognized. In France, there are memorials specifically to horses. In Belgium, there are memorials to the dogs that served with Belgian forces. In America, there are memorials to war dogs and horses. These memorials serve as reminders that war affects more than just human combatants, that the suffering extends to animals who have no choice and no understanding of why they're suffering. The story of animals in World War I also shows the relationship between humans and animals, especially in war. Soldiers formed bonds with the animals they worked with. These bonds were real, meaningful, and sometimes as strong as bonds between humans. Soldiers would risk their lives for their horses or dogs. They'd mourn when animals died. The animals provided companionship and emotional support in the midst of horror. There are accounts of soldiers talking to their horses, confiding in them, treating them as friends. The horses couldn't respond with words, but they were present, familiar, a connection to the peacetime world of farms and home. Dogs were even more companionable, able to show affection and loyalty in ways that helped soldiers cope with the stress of war. The relationship was reciprocal in ways that sometimes surprised soldiers. Horses would show attachment to their handlers, becoming nervous when separated from them. Dogs would refuse to leave wounded handlers, staying with them until help arrived. These displays of loyalty and attachment reminded soldiers that even in the dehumanizing environment of war, connections and caring were still possible. The animals, also, served as reminders of innocence and normalcy. A dog playing in the trenches, a pigeon cooing in its coop, a horse nuzzling its handler. These were moments of normal life in the midst of industrial slaughter. The animals helped soldiers remember they were human, helped them maintain some connection to the world before the war. Many soldiers came home with stories about animals: a horse that had carried them safely through danger, a dog that had saved lives, a pigeon that had made it through impossible conditions. These stories were told and retold, sometimes becoming family legends passed down through generations. The animals lived on in memory long after they died. The stories took on mythic qualities over time. A horse that had survived multiple battles became the horse that could sense incoming shells and would warn its rider. A dog that had found wounded soldiers became the dog that saved hundreds. A pigeon that had flown through a storm became the pigeon that flew through impossible conditions. The truth was impressive enough, but memory and time added layers to these stories. Grandchildren would hear about the horse their grandfather had worked with, the bond they'd shared, the dangers they'd survived together. These stories kept the memory of individual animals alive long after they'd died. They also served to pass down lessons about loyalty, courage, and the bonds between humans and animals. The use of animals in World War I declined as technology advanced. By World War II, trucks and tanks had largely replaced horses for transport and combat. Radio had mostly replaced pigeons for communication, but animals were still used, and even today, military dogs serve in combat zones, detecting explosives, finding enemy fighters, providing security. The transition wasn't immediate. Even in World War II, horses were used extensively by some armies. The German army used hundreds of thousands of horses throughout World War II, despite being associated with mechanized warfare. The Soviet army used horses extensively. Horses remained part of military operations well into the 20th century. Pigeons continued to serve in World War II, carrying messages in situations where radio was unreliable or compromised. Dogs served in even greater numbers than in World War I, with more sophisticated training and more diverse roles. The lessons learned from animal service in World War I were applied and expanded in later conflicts. The tradition of military working dogs continues into the present. These dogs are highly trained, valuable, and treated as soldiers themselves. When military dogs are killed in action, they're honored with ceremonies and memorials. The recognition that animals serve and sacrifice has increased over time, partly because of the precedent set by animals in World War I. Modern military dogs serve in roles that would have been familiar to World War I handlers in new roles enabled by modern training. They detect explosives and drugs, search for enemy combatants, guard installations, provide therapy to soldiers dealing with stress and trauma. The dogs are partners to their handlers, valued members of military units. When a military dog is killed, the response shows how attitudes have changed since World War I. The dog receives full military honors. The handler and unit mourn. The dog may be memorialized with a plaque or monument. This recognition would have been rare in World War I, when most animals died with little acknowledgement. The change shows growing appreciation for animal service and sacrifice. The horses, dogs, and pigeons of World War I couldn't tell their own stories. They couldn't write memoirs or give interviews. Their experiences are known only through the accounts of the soldiers who worked with them and the records that were kept. But their service was real, their contribution essential, and their suffering immense. We know their stories through letters soldiers wrote home, through diaries kept during the war, through official reports and veterinary records, through photographs and film footage. These sources show glimpses of animal experiences, filtered through human observation and understanding, but still revealing the crucial role animals played. Understanding their role helps us understand the war more completely. It shows the limitations of technology at the time, the extent to which armies still relied on methods and tools from earlier eras. It shows the human-animal bond under the most extreme conditions. and it raises questions about the ethics of using animals in war that remain relevant today. The reliance on animals in World War I shows the war was a transition period. It was fought with some modern technology like machine guns, artillery, poison gas, and airplanes. But it was also fought with horses, dogs, and pigeons because the technology to fully replace them didn't exist yet. The war straddled two eras, one foot in the past and one in the future. This technological transition made the war particularly brutal for animals. They were used in ways that exposed them to modern weapons they had no defense against. A horse pulling artillery was vulnerable to machine gun fire in a way it wouldn't have been in earlier wars. Dogs searching no man's land faced hazards that didn't exist before mechanized warfare. The animals paid a price for the transition to modern war. The animals that served in World War I were there because humans put them there. They did what they were trained to do, what they were forced to do, with no understanding of the causes or consequences of the war. Their loyalty, strength, and instincts were exploited for military purposes. They saved human lives, and their own lives were often spent cheaply. This exploitation raises moral questions. Was it right to use animals this way? The people making the decisions thought so, believed it was necessary. The soldiers working with animals often felt conflicted, caring for their animals while also using them in dangerous ways. There's no simple answer, just the recognition that animals paid a price for human conflicts. They deserve to be remembered, not just as tools that were used, but as living beings that suffered, that served, that died in a war they had no part in starting. The 8 million horses, the hundreds of thousands of dogs and pigeons, the countless other animals, they were casualties of the war just as much as the human soldiers. The remembrance is important because it acknowledges the full cost of war. When we count casualties, we usually count only humans. But animals suffered and died in huge numbers. Their deaths mattered to the people who worked with them. Their service contributed to military outcomes. They deserve to be part of the historical record. When we remember World War I, we should remember them. The horse that pulled artillery through the mud until it couldn't go on. The dog that found a wounded soldier in the dark. The pigeon that flew through fire to deliver a message that saved a battalion. They were heroes without choice, serving without understanding, dying without knowing why. Their heroism is different from human heroism because it lacks the element of choice and understanding. A soldier who charges enemy positions understands the risk and chooses to do it anyway. A horse pulling a gun toward enemy lines doesn't understand what's happening and just obeys its training and its handler. Does that make the horse's service less valuable? Or does it make it more poignant because the animal has no choice? Their story is part of the story of the war. It's a story of sacrifice, suffering, loyalty, and loss. It's a story that needs to be told, not to glorify war or to sentimentalize animals, but to honor the truth of what happened and to recognize all who suffered and served. The truth includes the fact that war consumes everything in its path. Not just human lives, but animal lives. Not just soldiers, but the horses they rode, the dogs they worked with, the pigeons that carried their messages. The destruction was total, affecting every living thing caught up in the conflict. These spies weren't the glamorous figures of fiction. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. They lied, stole, betrayed, and sometimes killed, all while believing they were serving a greater good. Whether they were right is something each of us has to judge for ourselves. The animals, unlike spies, had no agenda, no ideology, no belief in a greater good. They simply did what they were trained to do, what their nature compelled them to do. They were loyal because that's what dogs and horses are. They returned home because that's what pigeons do. Their service was pure in a way human service rarely is, uncomplicated by politics or belief. The shadow war of espionage in World War I reminds us that history is more complex than we usually think. Behind every battle, behind every political decision, there were secret operations and hidden motives. Understanding these hidden aspects doesn't change the basic facts of the war, but it does make the story richer and more human. The animal story also adds richness and complexity. It reminds us that war affects more than just human combatants. It shows the dependence of human warfare on animal labor and sacrifice. It reveals the bonds between humans and animals even in the worst circumstances. The animals of World War I are part of the hidden history, rarely emphasized in accounts that focus on battles and generals, but essential to understanding how the war was actually fought. The story of animals in World War I is ultimately a story about connection and loss. The connection between soldiers and the animals they worked with, built through shared danger and hardship. The loss when those animals died, mourned by soldiers who'd come to depend on them and care for them. These connections and losses were real and meaningful, part of the human experience of war. In the vast narrative of World War I, with its millions of human casualties and its transformative impact on history, the story of animals might seem like a footnote. But for the soldiers who worked with these animals, for the handlers who cared for them, for the officers who depended on them, the animals were essential. They were partners, companions, tools, and victims all at once. The 8 million horses that died represent individual animals, each with their own personality and history. The dogs that searched for wounded soldiers each had names and relationships with their handlers. The pigeons that flew through artillery fire each made individual choices to keep flying when they could have given up. Behind the statistics are millions of individual animal lives, each mattering to someone, each contributing to the war effort in their own way. When we tell the story of World War I, we need to tell their story too. We need to remember that the war was fought not just by soldiers with rifles and generals with plans, but by horses pulling guns through mud, dogs searching for wounded in the dark, pigeons flying through fire. The animals were there, serving and suffering, and their story deserves to be told. The memorial in London has it right. They had no choice. That simple statement captures the essential tragedy and the essential heroism of animal service in war. They didn't choose to be there. They didn't understand what was happening, but they served anyway, with loyalty and courage that came from their nature and their training, and millions of them died doing it. As we move further from World War I, as the last human connections to that war fade with the passing of the final generation who heard first-hand stories from veterans, the animal story becomes even more important to preserve. It's part of full truth of what happened, part of the complete account of the war that changed the world. The animals that served in World War I can't be thanked. They're long gone, over a century dead, but they can be remembered. Their service can be acknowledged. Their suffering can be recognized, and the lessons from their story can be learned and applied, ensuring that if animals must serve in future conflicts, they're treated with the respect and care they deserve. Modern militaries do treat animals better than they were treated in World War I. Military working dogs today are valued, well cared for, given veterinary attention, and honored when they're killed or retired. This is progress, built on the recognition that animals in military service are not just equipment, but living beings that deserve consideration. But the fundamental question remains unresolved. Should animals be used in war at all? When their service saves human lives, when their capabilities exceed what technology can provide, when military necessity demands it, is it justified to put animals in danger? There's no universal answer, just ongoing debate and the requirement that we think seriously about the ethics of our choices. The story of animals in World War I forces us to confront these questions. It shows us both the value of animal service and the cost animals paid. It reminds us that war affects all living things, that suffering extends beyond human combatants, that the bonds between species persist even in the worst circumstances. 8 million horses died in World War I, but the ones that survived did something no human soldier could do. They pulled impossible loads through impossible terrain. They provided mobility and logistics when no alternative existed. They worked with loyalty and determination until they literally could go no further. And in doing so, they helped win the war. At a cost we're still trying to fully understand and acknowledge. The dogs crawled through no man's land, finding wounded soldiers in conditions where human searchers would have failed. The pigeons flew through artillery barrages, carrying messages that saved battalions. The horses pulled guns into position for the barrages that supported attacks. Each of these actions, multiplied by millions across 4 years of war, shaped the outcome of battles and campaigns. Their contribution was essential. Without them, the war would have been different, longer, bloodier. The armies that used animals most effectively had advantages over those that didn't. The animals, unwitting and uncomprehending, influenced the course of human history through their service and sacrifice. So, when we remember World War I, let's remember all who served, the soldiers who fought and died, the civilians who suffered under occupation and bombardment, and the millions of animals who had no choice, no understanding, but who served anyway and paid a terrible price. They all deserve to be remembered. They all are part of the story, and their story, the full story including the animals, is the true story of World War I. The animals of World War I were heroes and victims simultaneously. They displayed courage without understanding what courage was. They showed loyalty without ideology. They endured suffering without comprehension. Their service was pure and tragic, uncomplicated by the politics and hatreds that drove human combatants, but no less real and no less costly. In the end, the story of animals in World War I is a mirror reflecting back to us questions about ourselves. How we treat animals in extreme circumstances reveals something about our values and our humanity. and the soldiers who cared for their horses and dogs, who mourned when they died, who did their best to protect them even while using them in dangerous ways, they showed that compassion can persist even in war. And the fact that we remember these animals now, over a century later, that we build memorials to them and tell their stories, shows that we recognize a debt. We acknowledge that their service mattered, that their suffering was real, that they deserve to be honored even though they could never understand or seek such honor. In remembering them, we become more fully human ourselves. Subscribe for more untold stories from history.